Oh dear. Here we are.
Okay.
Well, I hope this is going to work now. I'm sorry. I'm afraid this technology just leaves me completely blank. I don't understand it at all. And I'll try and whip through this presentation. This is the second part of a two-part presentation on Russian tramways. And just for those of you who can't quite visualize seeing, here is an exploded map of Russia. Obviously, it goes over many, many time zones and thousands of miles. And the majority of the tramways are in the west, in the area, as you see, marked as Moscow, Kazan, and so forth. But there are also some further in the east and in Siberia generally. So this evening's presentation is about the environment served by the tramways. And of course, Russians, a lot of them live in blocks of flats, quite monotonous sort of blocks, but different types. This is a pair of trams in Rostov-on-Don and a pair of RVZ6 trams in Salavat. And in addition to the blocks of flats, of course, you have one of these wonderful contraptions of the heating pipes constructed to go over the tramway, or in some cases over the roads. Sometimes the flats are a bit more remote from the tram line, which is built at some distance away, as in this example. There is also a lot of older housing, wooden housing particularly. This is a view in Arkhangelsk, no, I'm sorry, in Komsomolsk, now Amurye, which is one of the tramways that has been abandoned since this view was taken. This is in the Russian Far East. And this is a view, not untypical actually, of a street running tramway with unpaved or very badly broken paved tram track in Barnaul in Siberia. Another fairly narrow street, almost reserved for trams, although road vehicles do use it with some difficulty, is this view in Rostov-on-Don with nice old houses. And we'll see more of this in a few minutes. Not all the tramways are in built-up areas. There are some quite striking rural sections. This is in Volchansk in the North Urals, where there is a single tram line about 6 kilometers in length that wends its way through all sorts of different country vistas between one small village and another. For a long time, the tramway was run on a gratis basis by the staff just to keep themselves employed, even though they received no money for doing so. But I understand that the local authority now gives some sort of a grant to keep the tramway running. Also in the North Urals is Krasnoturinsk, which is a big aluminium smelting town. And there's a single line of tramways surviving there. There were two, one has been closed, but the east-west line survives, as far as I know. It's single track, and this is one of the turning loops where the tram threads its way around a circle with cows grazing in the foreground. We're in the North Caucasus region at the town of Pyatigorsk, which is an old Russian spa town. And the tram here is a former Hala T4 Tatra, and 2 of the 5 hills after which the town is named can be seen in the background. Another tramway which has a considerable rural section, and in fact in this case runs up a fairly lengthy hill to reach an escarpment on the higher town is in Prokopyevsk in the Kuzbas region of Siberia. And you could vaguely think that you were in Swiss territory here with the individual housings, the valley, and of course the snow-covered terrain. Also in Siberia is this remarkable tramway, which has only 6 cars at Cheryomushki. It was built to serve a major hydroelectric plant that was constructed in the 1990s to take the workers between the plant and the housing colony. And the service is planned on the basis of providing free transport for them, but others can use it. The line is probably about 4 to 5 kilometers in length, basically an hourly service in the Altai region. And here's another view of the Altai region, the Cheryomushki tramway in rather more favorable weather. The tram, as I say, runs hourly. A single car, double-ended car, quite unusual in Russia, double-ended St. Petersburg built car, although in peak periods, coupled cars are operated. So it's one of the few tramways with double-ended, double-sided cars. Now we'll have a look at some of the infrastructure of sorts in the Russian tramways. And here is absolutely minimal infrastructure, in other words, none whatsoever, at one of the stops in Cheryomushki, which is a town to the east of St. Petersburg, with a main tram line. As you can see, 2 cars on the approach. It's a frequent service, but no provision whatsoever for shelter for intending passengers. This is in Ufa, and we've got up a little bit insofar as there's a series of barriers at the side of the track on which people can rest themselves whilst they're awaiting the arrival of the next car. This view was obviously taken some years ago because it's got an RVZ car in the foreground. It was taken about 2001. Moving on a little bit in Kemerovo, again, another town in the Kuzbas region, we've got a fairly rudimentary shelter without any protection at either side, but at least there's a little bit of roof to give protection to the passengers. And a rather more substantial, but in this case inadequate shelter in Usoye-Sibirskoye, which is a town about, I don't know, 30 or 40 kilometers north of Irkutsk. And there is an industrial area segregated from the main residential quarters to the north of the tram lines. And as you can see here, it was factory turning out time whilst they're all waiting for the tram to approach to take them back to the town. A more substantial shelter you will see here in Ryazan, a tramway, by the way, which has since been closed. It was reduced to only 3 cars in operation on one line at the time I saw it back in 2004, I think it was, or 2003. And since then, it has been closed. There are 1 or 2 instances, and only that, where trams receive some sort of priority over other general traffic. And this is an example. You can see suspended from the span wire a signal lamp which illuminates red, although not very well, a very sort of 5-watt bulb in there to warn general traffic that a tram is emerging. This is in Zlatoust, which proclaims itself the last tramway in Europe before you cross into Asia. And it's an interesting tram because it's KTM 5 car, which has been locally modified to have a low floor section at the back, and the rear door, which has been modified. When opened, there is a retractable ramp inside which can fold down onto the carriageway to allow wheelchair users to access the tram. It's a homemade job, but at least some concession to the way things are going generally. Here's another example of a tram priority. This is in Osiniki, which is a diminutive tramway in the Kuzbas region, but a lovely one. And it's almost entirely single track and loop, not entirely, but almost. And this is the loop at the route to and from the railway station with a KTM 5 tram coming out from the station direction to join the main line, and protected here, as you see, by the red signal. And strangely enough, as you'll see in a minute, Osiniki has got a second example of tram priority. But here's an example, a rare example of modern practice in Ulan-Ude, where a big tramodrome has been built in the suburbs, where tram lines approach from all 4 points of the compass. And the entire circuit, quite remarkably for Russia, is equipped with automatic points. Normally, all point changing in Russia is done manually, even in the big cities, although the odd automatic equipment is being installed now. But this is a fine example in one of the very few progressive tramways in Russia. You'll notice there the car on the right has got an inscription on the side panels marking 50 years of tramway operation in Ulan-Ude, which is the capital of the Buryat semi-autonomous region south of Irkutsk. This I would describe as Pole City. This is, again, Prokopyevsk, which I freely admit is one of my favorite Russian tramways. And you can see here the magnitude of poles that have been erected, center poles, which is the normal practice in Prokopyevsk, on the line to the bread factory, Khlyeb-Zavod, and also to the right, in the background, you can see a pair of headstocks from one of the local coal mines. This is a major coal mining area of Russia, and there is a lot of industrial background to be photographed, as you'll see. Now, here is an example of something which is both accurate and useless. Do have a look at the timetable for Route 2. In the morning peak between 6 and 9, the tram runs every 73 minutes, and then the off-peak frequency claims to be every 349 minutes. That's 5 hours and 49. But if you look at it very carefully, you will in fact find that the last car of the morning peak is also the first of the afternoon. So why anything was put in the gap for 9 to 15 hours beats me. It really is the most useless piece of information. And by the time you've studied it and worked out when the tram might come, there must be a good chance it's passed you by without stopping. Let's have a look at some railway crossings. This is one with a rather wonky set of signals, and it's in it's in Komsomolsk-na-Amur in the Russian Far East, system that's since been closed, although it's just a possibility it may reopen. And this is in Barnaul, where, as you can see, there is a catch point laid on the approach to the level crossing, which has a barrier for road traffic, but nothing for the tram. Some interlaced track. This is in Pyatigorsk, one of Russia's only 2 surviving meter gauge tramways. Pyatigorsk, as I said earlier, is a town, spa town in the North Caucasus region with quite an extensive tramway, and it has a fleet of cars, some Tatras and some built by the Uskatav factory, the KTM models. Another piece of interlaced track, and not the sort of thing you expect to find right in the center of a capital city, is close to Kursky Vokzal in Moscow, where the cars on line 24 descend from the railway station and have to pass under the main railway lines before proceeding to the suburbs. The track is laid out on the interlaced principle, and it is in fact a very frequent service through here. Now, here's some track maintenance going on during the summer months, regular maintenance. We're in Krasnodar, and the Russian enthusiasts themselves will tell you that Krasnodar is their best tramway. It is very well run, the cars are well maintained, and so is the track, and there's good frequency of service. And one of the reasons behind it is that the long-serving manager is fully acquainted with where to get the best equipment for his tramway's needs, and has been doing so for the last 20 or 30 years. Here's some more track work going on whilst trams approach, and this is in Saratov. And you see here another feature of Russian tramways, which is the parallel operation by a trolleybus service. Russia thinks nothing of erecting trolleybus wires in parallel with long stretches of tramway, something that would have been regarded aghast in much of Western Europe, but it happens a lot in Russia. And as I say, this is an example in Saratov. Maintenance doesn't stop in the bad weather. This is in Khabarovsk, again in the Russian Far East, and a pointsman here clearing snow and ice from the tracks to prevent disaster. And I reckon this young lady, because that's what this tramways employee is, I reckon she must have been late for work, and as a punishment was sent out to clear frozen ice from the tracks in Komsomolsk when the temperature was just below -30 centigrade. Not the most pleasant of tasks, but it has to be done to keep the trams running. Major tram junctions can be found here and there, and not necessarily just in the center of towns. This is one in the suburbs of Bisk, where routes converge from several directions. And as you can see, there's a huge array of point work to allow cars to process from various directions to others. And some tramways still have fossilized track work. This is in Vladikavkaz, which is in the North Caucasus, right on the border with Georgia. And in fact, the mountains that you can see in the background do signify the border with Georgia. It's that close. The tramways have been run down a lot in recent years. And this is one of a number of Tatra T3 cars that they've acquired from Magdeburg. They also have some Tatras from Dresden. Now, one or two odd tramway layouts, and you must bear in mind that most of these were laid down when there was absolutely minimal road traffic in Russia, and the trams had right of way, but now, either coming off or going on to side reservation, they march into the center of the road for their street running track under the railway bridge and have to run the gauntlet of the traffic, which is obviously now of much greater volume than was the case when the tramways were laid down. Now for some bridges, and this is one of several bridges in St. Petersburg, though sadly this one is no longer served by trams. It is served by trolley buses. You can see the wiring there, but trams no longer serve this. This is the Bolshoi bridge, erected in, I think, 1908 to 1911, as it says there on the arch. And this is a typical LVS 86 articulated tram operated in St. Petersburg. Now, a second view in St. Petersburg is of Grenadier Bridge, which still retains tram track for depot access purposes, although there is no longer any regular service over it. And you'll see this is a lifting bridge, of which there are several in St. Petersburg. And the overhead is so laid out that when the bridge lifts in the middle of the night, the overhead goes up with it. And hopefully when the bridge retracts, it all fits in jolly nicely. All the lifting bridges in St. Petersburg lift at a scheduled time in the middle of the night. The times are published in the local newspaper so that motorists, what have you, can know when to avoid which particular bridges. They close sequentially, roughly between 1 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the morning. Another bridge here, and again, a parallel tram and trolleybus operation in Chelyabinsk, with a typical example of a girder railway bridge that is to be found throughout Russia. And another railway bridge, but in this case, stone supports in Kazan. Kazan is the capital of an oil-rich autonomous, semi-autonomous Republic of Tatarstan. And with the receipts from oil revenue, in recent years, amongst other things, the city has completely renovated, rebuilt, relocated its tramways and renewed the rolling stock, such that several routes I saw in the early years of this century are no longer in operation, this being one of them. And over in the Far East, in Vladivostok, we have an example of what I would call a Japanese tram bridge without any sidewalls or side supports over a small creek. But this is the sort of thing that is to be found in many systems in Japan. But they're not all old bridges. This is a completely new one constructed in Ufa with relayed track, slightly realigned to take the tram route down from the higher town to the railway station. You can see the railway line down on the extreme right there, amidships, and the trams, the 2 or 3 routes that serve the railway station, and then climb up quite steeply graded section actually towards the city centre. This is a KTM 23 bogie car of fairly recent origin, built in the early 2010s. Not all bridges are reserved for trams, nor are they traffic free. And this is a classic example in Irkutsk of a KTM 5 car battling its way through traffic. And also it'll have to avoid these pedestrians who themselves are endeavouring to cross the road amongst the traffic. A typical scene in the Russia of today, with every man and woman for him or herself. This is one of the more impressive bridges served by tram. This is in Nizhny Novgorod, and it's over the Volga, which has a confluence with another river just up to the right here, about a kilometre away. And here we have the bridge that I've used for the opening, the title sequence of these talks. This is the International Bridge in Orsk, but this view was taken when the tram track was entirely street running in the center of the bridge. And you can see that it's coming out of Europe to go into Asia. There's the sign on the traction pole there, Europa. And just to make the point, in the other direction, with the tram track now relocated at the side of the bridge on reservation, the tram coming from the Asian sector back into Europe. Both Orsk, which is a relatively small tramway, and Magnitogorsk, one of the bigger ones, have international bridges served by trams. So from bridges, a few views of water, and here we are in St. Petersburg with the Neva in the background. And back here in Cheryamushki, the tramway that serves the hydroelectric power plant in the Altai region, a very attractive line, I have to say, contrasts very favorably with many of the urban lines in Russia. This is in Zlatoust, and the main lake in the background, as you can see, the tramway here skirting it and linking the main part of the town with an area of older wooden housing that faces the lake. And St. Petersburg in the winter with ice floes on the River Neva, and one of the more modern vehicles in the fleet, a double-ended car, as you see here, KTM, I think it's KTM 31, actually this view was taken in early February one year, which was a relatively mild winter. Normally the river, there was a good chance it would be completely iced up, as in this view in Komsomolsk-na-Amur at the tram terminus called River Station, Rechnoy Vokzal, with a KTM 6 there, desperately awaiting passengers, of which there were none, except for the 4 of us who were on this trip. And the white expanse that you can see in the distance between the hills and the tram is in fact the totally frozen River Amur. And there were plenty of people actually skating upon it. In the summer, of course, free flowing, and there are river cruises that call here. There's a big river station, and no doubt many of the passengers take the tram into the town, which is about 1.5 to 2 kilometers distant. So a different type of station now, railway stations. And this is a view in Moscow, and one of 3 railway stations in very close proximity. That's Yaroslavskaya, and there's also Leningradskaya and Kazanskaya. A bit like Euston, St. Pancras and King's Cross in Britain, all very close together. And appropriate, having shown you Yaroslavskaya, to show you the other end, the station at the other end of its principal route, which is the Trans-Siberian, that goes all the way from Moscow right across Russia to Vladivostok. And in those days, Vladivostok station was still served by tram. It isn't now, although Vladivostok, having been on the cusp of closure, has acquired some good second-hand trams from Moscow, is believed to have some more on order, and amongst other things is looking to reopen the line to the railway station within the next 2 or 3 years. This is another famous station. This is in St. Petersburg, and it is Finlansky Vokzal, heavily rebuilt since the days when Lenin arrived here after his journey in a closed carriage across Europe. And this is a view of the other meter gauge tramway in Russia, Russia detached, because this is Kaliningrad, the tramway that was inherited from Germany at the end of the last war. Kaliningrad was formerly Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, and by all accounts and the photographs I've seen, a most attractive place, completely laid waste by bombing at the end of the war. But the tramway, although seriously damaged, did survive. And unlike many Russian tramways at meter gauge, which over the years have been regauged, Kaliningrad retains meter gauge. And this is a KT4 Tatra car outside Kaliningrad station. A more grandiose, very celebratory design of station is here in Irkutsk, with the inevitable plethora of taxis and minibuses loading outside, as well as private vehicles. But it does also show a feature of Irkutsk, which is unusual amongst Russian tramways, in that Irkutsk has a far greater percentage of street running tramway than almost any other. Leaving aside perhaps St. Petersburg and Moscow, of the provincial towns and cities, this is one where the great majority of the track is laid in the street. And here's another railway station in Siberia. This is at Kemerovo. And just to make the point, of course, they have a plinth railway locomotive outside the station. I'm not a railway person, but a lot of stations, important stations in Russia, do have stuffed locomotives on plinths, but they're normally inside the station itself on some piece of reserved track alongside the main lines. Kemerovo has this one on display outside, and a very smartly turned out KTM 5 taking the curve, I would mention. Some religious architecture now. This is one of two cathedrals in St. Petersburg. It's not St. Isaac's, that's served by trolleybus. And I've forgotten after whom this cathedral is known, whom it's dedicated. But fortunately, although line 28 no longer runs, the trams do still pass this rather impressive edifice. Another image I've always rather liked is this view in Novokuznetsk with the tram track going through the center of the roundabout. Lots of snow, of course, in the foreground in winter, and the church nicely positioned behind. In recent years, since the fall of the USSR, the Russian Orthodox Church has been busy building new churches all over the country. This is one that's been created in Novotroitsk. Novotroitsk is an industrial town in the South Urals, not far from Orsk, actually, where the international bridge was. This is a rather older edifice in Rostov-on-Don, by the main market, the Rynok, in the city, and a variety of trams there, KTM 19 and KTM 5, and very impressive ecclesiastical architecture. And the other religions are not ignored. This is a mosque in Nizhny Kamsk, which is again in Siberia, in central Siberia, or perhaps western Siberia, and a KTM 23 car passing by. The combination here of religion and politics in Chelyabinsk, with one of their KTM 5 cars passing the church, and President Putin offering himself for re-election in March 2018. Strong president for strong Russia, it says. Now some hills. It's a common misconception that Russia is a flat country, featureless, with mile upon mile of silver birch trees, only alleviated by large monotonous housing estates. There are quite a number of hills, and in fact, it probably got more hilly tramways than most countries. This is one in Smolensk. It is reputed to be the steepest tramway hill in Russia. And certainly the cars that are authorized to work on it have Lisbon style, a white rectangle on the bogie frames to indicate that they've got special braking equipment. This is one of my favorite hills. This is in Khabarovsk. And as you can see, two trams here, but most importantly, I draw your attention to the red signal lamp on the traction pole to the left of the photograph. This is a signal controlled hill. There are stops at the extreme summit, both here and at the far side, but nothing in the middle. There is no intermediate stop at all. And only one tram is allowed in the entire section from summit to summit at any one time. And no further tram will be allowed down, for instance, until the one in the distance has crested the hill and the red lamp is extinguished. This is another very fine hill track, which I would liken to Dog Kennel Hill in Dulwich in London, as it's a 4-track layout, but it's obviously seen better days. There's a great deal of industry in the distance, but a lot of Soviet industry is in decline. And I had to wait a long time for this view, although there is, you can probably make out, another tram in the far distance. 4 tracks, 2 up and 2 down. And the idea certainly was, and probably still is, that they're used alternately. This is in Saratov. Now, here's a real vicious one. This is in Ufa. And I showed you a few minutes ago a view of a tram going over the new bridge to the railway station. Well, it will have come from the town along the tracks that enter the picture at the bottom left here, and then take a violent turn to the left to go down some reserved track to the railway station. As you can see, the steep hill beyond does not look particularly suitable for trams. And it's, I think, relevant that just behind me, there is a tramways control point, which is manned, or more often womaned, throughout the hours of operation. And trams have a compulsory stop at that point, and she will go out with her metal hammer and check that the brakes are free and that the wheels seem to be in good condition. And only then will a tram be allowed to proceed. And I can't help feeling, because this sort of thing is normally only put in place after there has been an incident, that at some point one car has failed to take the curve and met with some measure of disaster. But it's not the only place where such facilities can be found. There's one in this lovely street in Rostov-on-Don. You get some idea of the gradient by looking at the build of the housing on the left. As you can see, the paving is rather rough. And on the downward gradient, there is this tramways control point, similar to the one that there was in Ufa. And the woman there is getting ready to stop the tram. In the track, there is a hem shoe. You can possibly just make it out to the right as we look at the photograph, to the right of the woman's legs. And the tram will stop just short of that while she goes round with her long-handled hammer to check the brakes and ensure that they are freed off. And it's interesting that, as I understand it, only Tatra trams are allowed to work this route. And that is because of their superior braking capability. KTM cars are considered to be inadequate for this sort of gradient. And if you see what it's like at the bottom, you'll perhaps understand why they don't want a nasty incident here. And before we leave Hills, a more modern view in Ulan-Ude, taken only 3 years ago, with various types of tram on the one of the local lines. It's a 4 or 5 line system, and this rather nice undulating section, which clearly indicates a sort of frequency of service, which is quite common on many provincial Russian tramways. More hills. This is in Osiniki, and here's a Belarus-built BKM tram. They've got 2 of them, and by all accounts don't think much of them, but ascending the hill to the summit, where again we have an instance of tramway priority. The tram comes up the hill as fast as it can, and particularly in bad weather, it's essential that it's given free passage across the main road here onto its own reserved track into the town centre. And so we have signs and lamps to bring all road traffic to a halt. It's activated by a signal from the overhead by an ascending tram, and you can probably just see in the overhead by that adjustable leg that there is a skate to cancel the red light once the tram has reached the top. This is one of the hills in Nizhny Novgorod. Nizhny Novgorod is a very hilly city. In fact, it's built on 2 levels. To the west of the river Volga, it's relatively flat, and to the east, it's extremely hilly. And this is the double track reservation that leads down from the high town down towards the river. And there's another view here, in this case showing you a tram carrying a legend celebrating 110 years of electric tramway operation in the city. It was the first electric tramway in the present-day territory of Russia. I use my words carefully because Kiev, which is now in Ukraine, was earlier with electric traction in 1892, but Nizhny Novgorod came first in Russia, and it was 3 years later before Moscow got electric trams. Some industry. It wouldn't be Russia without some heavy industry. And this is a view from my hotel bedroom window in Nizhny Novgorod, in Nizhny Tagil, pardon me, Nizhny Tagil, right in the center of town. And as you can see, a lot of smoke issuing forth in the distance, some preserved steam railway locomotives there on the right, and more modern rolling stock behind. Nizhny Tagil is the center of very heavy industry in the North Urals. And although I wasn't outside at the hotel room at this time, the outside air temperature was -46. It had warmed up a bit by the time we went out to photograph the trams, I'm pleased to say, down to -32. It's cold enough. Now, here's a factory in Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East. This is a rubber factory, Rubberovny Zavod, and one of what at the time was a big fleet of RVZ6 cars still in service in Khabarovsk. Khabarovsk, I should mention, is almost certainly the last place in Russia still running RVZ6 trams. We believe that there are still 10 in service. Osiniki has 1, but as far as I know, it's out of service at the moment. That doesn't mean to say it won't come back. It may be under heavy repair, but to see RVZ6 cars, you must go to the Russian Far East and go to Khabarovsk. This is somewhere you can no longer see RVZ6s, nor, I'm sorry to say, can you see the tramway. It's in Archangel in the north of Russia, and it's on part of the network. It wasn't isolated, but it was operated as such on Sombala Island. The tracks were connected to the main city system, but only used by journeys to and from the depot at the start and end of the day's service. In the background, by the way, was a big paper mill. Now, here's a tramway we haven't seen before. This is Naberezhny Chelny in the west of Siberia, and it's part of the rich oil-producing area of Tatarstan. You can see there pipes across the tramway. Naberezhny Chelny is a tramway that's been built post-war, and it's wholly on reserve track. Here's another center of the oil industry. This is Angarsk, north of Irkutsk. And here, although the oil refinery, as far as I know, is still in full working order, the tram service has lost a great deal of patronage, and after being severely reduced in recent years, almost all the industrial sections, which were extensive, have now been closed. This is outside depot number 1 in Kemerovo. It's a rebuilt KTM5 car. It's been quite extensively modernized, and a nice belching factory view on a cold winter's morning in the background. Some of the best industrial views are to be had in the Kuzbass, in my view. This is in the higher town in Prokopyevsk, with smoke and steam issuing from everywhere. And as you can see by the smoke rising from the twin chimneys in the background, virtually no wind. So there's a great deal of pollution in this area, as you can well imagine. A different industrial scene is at the giant hydroelectric plant in Cheryomushki, and here are a pair of cars waiting for the midday outmuster of office workers to go home for lunch. As you see, a giant dam here, which was built in the late 1980s and early 1990s. This view was taken on my first visit here, which I think was in 2006. And since then, there has been a terrorist incident here, which caused damage to the dam and some loss of life. And as a result, it's no longer possible to get quite as close to the dam as in this view. The trams still run up to here for the carriage of staff, but ordinary visitors have to stay a couple of 100 meters back. Here we are in Chelyabinsk with a very fine appendage to the local steelworks, which occupies an enormous footprint to the north of Chelyabinsk itself, and is served by a long tram route which goes round 3 sides of that footprint. It really is quite a lengthy route. In the coal district of the Kuzbass, a fine example of a Russian slag heap in the background, with overhead equipment that looks as though it could do with a little attention. One of their RVZ6 cars on the line to the railway station here. And in neighboring Prokopyevsk, again, one of my favorite tramways, the headstocks of the Koksovaya coal mine. And this is what I call the back side of the works. The front of it dominates the town centre. The route here, number 3, was at one time quite a frequent service. And during my last visit, it was only running in peak periods and was later closed, but has since, I'm pleased to say, been reopened. So that's very good. And this is a very heavy industrial area. Here's another view in Prokopyevsk, and this is in the town centre, dominated by the Koksovaya mine, with some really classic industrial vistas to be had here. Down the road in Novokuznetsk is this enormous steelworks, and here's one of the KTM 19 cars coming into a main tram terminal loop close to the works. And this is what has been described to me as a preserved steelworks in Nizhny Tagil, although the issuance of smoke from the background seems to me to indicate that at least some of it is still in working order. As I say, this is in Nizhny Tagil, and it is a very fine specimen of industrial architecture, I must say. A different type of industry is the aluminium smelting plant at Achinsk. Achinsk has two tram routes. The main one, the one which runs every few minutes, serves the main gates to the industrial plant. And in peak periods, three coupled sets of KTM 5s supplement the normal service of single cars. But most interestingly, in Achinsk, there is a secondary line, line 2, which serves just about the most desolate area of industry you can imagine. And here it is, double track, threading its way through hills of bauxite slag in this winter, very uncharming terrain. And it goes on its merry way for the full length of the industrial plant, just should there be anybody working in that district who needs the tramway, and that's a rarity. And here we are again on this line 2. The service is every 72 minutes. And I have to be honest and say that we have been very fortunate here in making good relations with the management, very friendly, who agreed to hire us a tram for the day in order that we could take views in the industrial part of the route. And the chief engineer, Evgeny, came with us. We had to wait until the 72-minute service had passed the depot before we went out and followed it so that we would have free rein. But so many were the stops that we took for different photographs. By the time we got to the terminus, the service car had come round again. And of course, we wanted to take photographs on the return journey. And the engineer went up to the crew of the car and told them to swap cars, and they took over our private hire tram and we took over their service car, and had another 72 minutes of photography on the way back. And then they entertained us to a lovely buffet lunch in the depot before we went out for another exercise later, which you'll see in a few minutes. So let's leave industry behind for a minute and look at some tram streets, as we call them. These are streets that have got a proper name and they're flanked by housing, but the area is totally unmade, it's unmetalled, and only really passable to four-wheel vehicles in good weather. Several months of the year when you would have great difficulty getting down here. This is in Novocherkassk, and here's another example, but it's actually side-running reservation in Omsk. Omsk trams can be distinguished from others by having their fleet numerals in that blue background oval. It could only be in Omsk. So despite Russia being a haven of standardization, there are little traits that can sometimes single out individual tramways. Now, when I showed this photograph to one of my former colleagues who worked in the bus industry, he roared with laughter and said it looks as though the tram's coming through a farmyard. And I said, yes, but they run every 5 minutes. And that's true. This is in Zlatoust, this lovely little tramway in the Urals region. And obviously in the summer months, with the lake unfrozen now, and the various wooden housing flanking this line. And this is the main line of the tramway that takes people from the lower town to the upper. This is Rostov-on-Don, the famous line 7, once you get beyond the very hilly stretch into a network of what we in Britain call Callan Hilling, with single track in parallel streets that crosses each other. And here's one of the number 7 cars coming on the inward journey towards the town. And oh, what's happened here? Now, here we are. I don't know what's happened there, but this is a view also in Rostov on this section of line 7 during the thaw in very late March in this case. These are in every respect the most treacherous conditions in which to go plodding around trying to get photographs of tram. The mudslides are terrible, and you really have to be very, very careful to avoid falling over. So some monuments now. Russia is very fond of monuments, and in this case, this is in Ust-Ilimsk, nowadays the most northerly tramway in Russia, in Siberia, connecting the town with a distant paper mill. And this is one of several sort of memorials put up, in this case in the town, announcing the name of the town. But there are also other monuments. This one is in Orsk. Aeroplanes are not uncommon, stuffed aeroplanes in Russia, but to get one quite as close to a tram route is quite unusual. Of course, here is the stuffed space rocket in Samara, a very fine tramway, and this is their pair of rebuilt Tatra T3 cars. But the space rocket, of course, rather dwarfs them. This is in Kaliningrad with one of their ex-Hala Tatra T4 cars, and celebrating the end of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia, in 2006, with great banners across the road here to mark the occasion. Sometimes there are monuments to different people to be found alongside. This is in Ulan-Ude with a warrior, a spear-carrying warrior. I don't know whether he's defending the tramway or the town, but it's an interesting aspect. And then, of course, no Russian city would be without its statue of Vladimir Ilyich, in this case in Prokopyevsk, looking down onto a fine piece of Stalin Empire architecture with a KTM 19 coming past in the foreground. And when we're talking about Stalin Empire architecture, which is what they know it as in Russia, here's the most famous one in Moscow on the bridge, which leads from the center down to Pavletsky Vokzal. The great city built to Stalin Empire design was Magnitogorsk, which is sitting on the boundary of Europe and Asia. This view was taken about 2004, before a monstrosity was erected on the middle island here, which has rather destroyed the view. But it is one of the most celebrated towns for Stalin Empire architecture. Here's another example, typically with the turret, in this case in Novokuznetsk, and a works car, as it happens, passing through. And just to give you an idea of the pollution in the Kuzbass that I referred to a few minutes ago, this is in Prokopyevsk at 10 o'clock in the morning. when the light was pretty awful, and also awful in the background was the town hotel, which had nothing of anything. They couldn't provide any food in the restaurant. They couldn't provide anything to drink, and they couldn't provide an early morning alarm call either. Terrible place. Now we go then to some fine pieces of architecture, and particularly I've chosen to show Kremlin. Now we all hear of the Kremlin as being in Moscow, and a lot of people think that that is the Kremlin. All it is the main one and the biggest one, but the Kremlin, or Kreml as it is in Russia, means fortress, and a lot of towns have one. And this is a small one in Kolomna, which is a town about 120 kilometers southeast of Moscow. And this is the Kreml in Smolensk, with a pair of coupled KTM 8M cars passing in front of it. One of the best, in my view, is in Nizhny Novgorod, and on the tram line that links from the low town to the high town. And the tram line actually goes round the foot of the Kreml and gradually climbs up to end up near its main gates. There's nothing like as frequent a service now, but as far as I know, the line still runs. Right, and here's another view in Nizhny Novgorod with a car on line 1 that's descended from the high town, and the towers of the Kreml in the background. This Kreml is a World Heritage Site. It's in Kazan, but sadly the trams no longer run in front of it. As I did say earlier, Kazan has relayed and reformed its tramway. It's got a lot of modern rolling stock, but a lot of the traditional lines of route have been closed. This is again in Nizhny Novgorod, one of several fine municipal buildings in the high town. And the local theatre, Dram Theatre in Nizhny Tagil. No self-respecting town would be without its theatre or its opera house, as the case may be. And this is the museum in Oryol. Oryol is a very nice town south of Moscow, which is considered to be a seat of learning. University professors here go to ponder their theses in their university vacations. This is the one they started but couldn't finish in Volchansk in the North Urals. It was intended to be the Dvorzec Kultury, the Palace of Culture, but as you can see, work stopped when the USSR broke up and has never resumed. The tramway, however, passes in front of it. This is the opera house in Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk has a big tramway. At one time, it was linked across the River Ob, but that work has been taken over by the metro. So it's now one of a number of Russian tramways that run in 2 parts. And it's not just museums and opera houses and so forth that have fine architecture. This is Vostanya metro station in St. Petersburg, where in those days the tram line crossed Nevsky Prospect. Most of the tram lines in central St. Petersburg have been closed, although there is one still running and prospering. This is also in St. Petersburg, and this rather fine arch was built in the 1830s to mark the defeat of Napoleon. and it's served here by both trams and trolleybuses. And here's another great memorial in St. Petersburg. Sorry, who's somebody speaking? In St. Petersburg. And the tram is one of the low floor LM 2005 type, many of which were supplied to Moscow, and they've got rid of them now to provincial towns and cities, and weren't very successful. Here's one that was either rebuilt or luckily escaped. It's one of the gates in Kaliningrad, and another of their Hala Tatra T4s coming through. Well, some views of markets, street markets particularly, and this at the mini Gorodok terminus in Vladivostok. Vladivostok no longer runs RVZ6 cars in passenger service, but has kept one, I understand, as a museum piece. This is right at the other end of Russia, really, the north in Arkhangelsk. There's an unattended vegetable and fruit stall. And a lot of Russian people have been pushed into poverty in recent years and resort to selling small quantities of seeds and what have you from unofficial stalls alongside the street. This image is in Pyatigorsk. And this is in Tomsk, with a group of ladies hoping somebody will come along and buy their fruit and veg. Some views now in the street, and drainage isn't always what it might be. This is a view taken admittedly some 30 years ago in Nizhny Novgorod, in the center of the town by the railway station terminus. The kvass trailer is a fixture in many Russian towns during the spring, summer and autumn. Kvass is a wheat beer, and you can go up to it and buy a plastic container, plastic glass of various sizes, quite cheap and very, very tasty and refreshing. The tram, by the way, is a Tatra T3 car from Chemnitz. Ufa had some Tatras of its own, but you can distinguish them because the Chemnitz cars retain their bogie shrouds as here. And in fact, it's also got the Chemnitz fleet number 436. This is a view in the town centre in Kazan in the old days, when the trams did actually have street running sections in the center of the town. And by contrast, this is the town center in Noginsk, which is a one route single line and loop tramway that was built in the 20s. It's to the east of Russia. It had an on and off existence in recent years and now has been closed. But equally, you can get very busy town and city centres with trams right in the middle of the road. Here, the setting down point, as you see, between the track and 2 or 3 lanes of traffic in Yekaterinburg. And you can also get these nice scenes of crowds storming the tram after there has been a substantial gap in the service. This is on the loop that goes round to Finlandsky Vokzal in St. Petersburg. Something that might surprise people is the situation in Samara, where there is about 2 kilometers of street running in the city centre, still equipped with centre poles, the sort of thing that was removed in most towns before the First World War. But Samara has retained them, both on an east-west and a north-south line. And for traffic congestion, I give you Kaliningrad, with trams fighting their way amongst and between all the general traffic that has assembled in that little enclave in recent years. This is a street view you can't take now in Moscow with one of their modern Vitesse type trams, one of the 300 low floor cars built by the firm founded by employees who broke away from Uskatav. And of course, a trolley bus there, all the trolley bus operation in Moscow has ceased now, except for one short circular line, which is retained as a museum operation, heritage operation. An unusual feature in Novocherkassk, it's the only place anywhere I know that does this, has its main town centre terminus as a reversing triangle. Nearly everywhere has a loop of some description, but in Novocherkassk, it's a reversing triangle. Some views in the streets in Rostov-on-Don here. This is the main line, the Route 1, very attractive section, not very well paved, but the route is attractive with the trees and the older buildings. And this is the town centre in Vladikavkaz, with again some older Russian buildings flanking the boulevard and an ex-Magdeburg Tatra T3, telling you it's Vladikavkaz just in case you didn't know you were there. This is a section in Nizhny Novgorod in Rozhdestvensky Street, which used to carry a very frequent tramway service, but the line over the bridge has been cut now, and the street has been pedestrianised, as you see here, with a single track tramway and a turning circle being constructed at this side of the river bridge. If you're queuing for a tram at Belaruski station in Moscow, you can, in the winter, take shelter in this remarkable contraption, which resembles, I suppose, a two-axle tram car of elderly vintage. And there it is in 2020, although the tram service, fortunately, is frequent enough that it probably isn't necessary very often. Here's a decorated car in Kazan some years ago, and one of many Moscow trams decorated with Christmas lights on the side. Something, by the way, that fell foul of the police, who have objected to them. I suppose they've got to have something to object to. Whether they will then reappear in future years, I don't know. A street scene in Arkhangelsk on Sombala Island, where there were 4 trams in operation on the network of routes on this island. And once every 4 hours, 3 of them used to meet up in this passing loop. The whole network laid as single track and loop. And as I say, 3 of the 4 every 4 hours would meet here. By contrast, we have all this new build in Barnaul. This is in Siberia. Nicely relayed track, modern trams, and a very modern appearance to the town. Here's a view in Moscow of 3 forms of transport: the KTM 19 tram, the monorail above, and you just poking its nose out on the right, one of the trolley buses when they were still running at this point. Of course, they've gone now. The monorail was threatened with closure, but I believe it's still running. And this is a view at what was a very insignificant place, it looks. Why do you put that in? Well, I put it in because it's actually at the most northerly point served by tramcar. This was in Arkhangelsk, at the terminus of line 3. And all I can tell you is that is the furthest north you could go in the world by tram car. Of course, you can't do it now. Trondheim in Norway is now the most northerly network. And on the landmass that is Europe and Asia, the most easterly point you could go by tram was this curve in Komsomolsk-na-Amur. And here's one of their RVZ6 cars that I think had been specially rebuilt to retain the rear D windows, which normally are removed and panelled over. And this is another view of the same curve in different conditions. And again, as I say, the most easterly point on our European and Asian landmass. Nearly there, and I'm just going to show you 2 or 3 examples of new build, because there isn't a lot of it. This is in Volgograd, and Volgograd, amongst its other normal street running routes, has an underground tramway, express tramway, with a long tunnel section. And at the southern end, the cars come out into the open to a turning circle, but you can see the start of the tunnel there to the right of the picture. And here's a view in one of their stations. Note that it's left-hand running in the tunnel, as indeed it is in the similar one in Kryvyi in the Ukraine. And there is a rollover further to the north of the line. This is completely new build in Kemerovo. Line 10 and line 3 were off for many years whilst the road was rebuilt, and at the same time the opportunity was taken to build a new alignment for the tramway and a flyover over the road. So here you see the ramp up, and here you see the long flyover on the northern side with the city and the river in the background. And this is a completely new alignment on what had been street running. One of the 2 tramways that does do a lot of development work is Naberezhny Chelny. It's entirely on reserve track. It has viaducts and quite a lot of underpasses, so there's virtually total segregation. And here's an example of one of their trams coming into a stop from about to go into a tunnel under one of their main arterial roads. Also new is some rolling stock in St. Petersburg, and particularly a little network in the east, which has been privatized. This is a view when it was still operated by the local tramway company. And since then, as I say, it has been privatized, a series of 4 routes, and this new fleet of Stadler articulated cars introduced. It's a very fine operation. The schedules are meticulously observed, and there's all the latest gadgetry and so forth. It's an example which I understand the city fathers in St. Petersburg want to extend to other parts of the network. This is an interior view of one of these Stadler articulated low floor cars. Well, finally, we have to have some snow views. You can't go without that. Here we are, -33 in Olsiniki, and the regulator at South Terminus is out there trying desperately to free off the track shoes here, which have frozen up. And it was a very difficult procedure. She didn't entirely succeed in doing so. And the motorwoman was instructed to take the car empty to depot to be thawed out. Here's the Volchansk tramway in the midst of winter. You can just about make the rails out in this covering of snow in the main street of the village of Volchansk. This is a view in the woods in Moscow. Always nice to get the snow on the trees. And at the three-track terminus of what was then called Detsky, what was it? It was the hospital, Children's Hospital, Detsky Bolnitsa in Moscow. The weary trudge home in the from the isolated Route 10 in Novokuznetsk. And it stopped snowing here in Tomsk, but as you can see, everything is nicely iced up, and where the snow plow has been through, or the snow broom, little mounds of snow left between the tracks. Coming out for the evening peak in Krasnoturinsk, when a second tram is put into service and staff from the depot are out there clearing the track to enable the points to be thrown over to ensure that when the tram comes back, it won't go into the depot. And here they are desperately scrambling around, trying to free off the point work to allow the car to have access to the mainline track. They did succeed, but it was interesting that the following day, the undertaking did not run, and it was alleged that it was too cold to run trams. One of my favorite tramways, Latust, with this lovely long reserve track line in amongst the little houses with the hills in the background. Winter wonderland, really. And again, another favorite in Khabarovsk, still the haunt of RVZ6 cars when I took this view, and it probably still is, with the little wooden houses and the roadside track on line 2, now operating only about every hour. And again, in Volchansk, the country tramway in the North Urals, with no housing around. There's just the odd farmstead here and there on its way to the village. But by contrast, in Moscow, we have the snow being cleared, including with the man on the roof, throwing the snow down onto the street below. But it's in the North Urals that I feel one can get some of the best snow views. And here we are with a Spectre tram of Nizhny Tagil heading off into the gloom of the foggy wastes of Nizhny Tagil. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I say farewell. Goodbye for now. Thank you.